Hi there, Bill Kristol here. Welcome to Bulwark on Sunday. Very pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Hannah Yoest, art director of the Bulwark, a longtime colleague and friend. Goes back to the Weekly Standard days. It's hard to believe since you're so young, but you must have come to work there when you were a teenager or something. But anyway, Hannah's also a published poet and a student of poetry, and I thought we would discuss poetry. And in particular, the occasion for this is that was it about a week ago? Hannah put in the Slack, the Bulwark Slack, the fact a poem by Marianne Moore, about whom I knew very little and still don't know much, called "Like a Bulwark," and thought it was an appropriate. I don't know what would you call that? A poem like for us that captured the spirit of our
Yeah.
Bulwark. So, though that poem is from 1957 or even before, I suppose, when it was first published. So, thank you for joining me and us, Hannah, and say a word about, how you came across that poem. I mean, are you a fan of Marianne Moore?
It's funny. I was only really familiar with her early work, but my husband and I were up in Boston running errands, and we have a book problem. As you can see, we're collectors.
Right.
And we stopped into Commonwealth Books, and they had just recently had an estate donate a large collection. So there were like stacks in the poetry section of books on the floor, and I saw this Marianne Moore book, and the collection is titled Like a Bulwark, and it felt like Kismet or something.
Yeah, and the poem itself, which
Yeah.
I guess at that time was called Bulwark Against Fate, but then she changed it to Like a Bulwark, actually, in
hmm
the
It went through a couple iterations.
in her final.
She's a big fan of rewriting.
So say a word about Marianne Moore. I'm not sure how much people know about her, and I think I have her dates here are 1887 to 1972. But say a word about just where she's from and why she's famous.
So Marianne Moore was she's Pennsylvania. She was a modernist poet, so she's contemporaries with T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens, all of the big like post-war poets who their whole thing was make it new. They
Post World War One, I should say.
Yeah,
That's
post
very
World War.
it's very
And
poetic. It's very much of a poet thing to say post war, and I think that was the big war, because that led to modernist
yeah,
poetry. World War II, that's just another like a footnote there.
they it's funny too because they traded a lot in contradictions. They wanted things to be new, but the way that they did so was through kind of reinvigorating older work. So if you think about the Cantos, Ezra Pound's kind of seminal work, it's mostly reimagining Old Miss, and then you have Marianne Moore. What her contribution was is the modernists weren't like a formal collective like some of the other movements. She was working independently. Like she and T.S. Eliot were actually from the same town, more or less, but they didn't know each other until much later. And she wrote her language was more plain, and her stylistic contribution was kind of cool enjambment. Like her style was syllabic. So she's compared to Emily Dickinson a lot. And the modernists in general owe a lot to Walt Whitman being kind of like an early forebearer. Um, yeah, the quote that a lot of people use that she is famous for is mixed plain American with which cats and dogs could read. And she put a lot of quotations in her writing. So her poems have this kind of weird, she like controls the reader with the pacing of words and the structure.
And just looking at it, there are these broken sentences
Mm-hmm.
and sentences that begin
Yeah.
that are indented and so forth, which
Yeah.
is, so it has the feeling of sort of fragments, but then it's obviously
Mm-hmm.
very carefully put together, and
Yeah.
is much more than just fragments. No, I was just struck by
Yeah.
tiny little bit of study of this over the last couple of days.
Yeah,
But
Pound and Elliot were really excited by like the lengths she would go to getting the number of syllables that she wanted in each line, and
wow.
then the enjambment is when you break a word mid and cut it off. So
And yeah, and Elliot praises her highly. And then I think you were saying before that when we got on the air that, and then Auden praises
mhm.
her a little later,
Yes.
right? In the
Yeah,
40s.
she in the 40s and 50s, she kind of reaches the apex of her career, and it is largely thanks to Auden selecting some of her later poems, um, which she's actually not a fan of. We can talk about that later. The poem that is her second most famous is she calls it a bit. She calls herself like a happy hack, and so she and Donald Hall actually calls the poem that's Auden's favorite a bit trite. So we could read that one, and you could pick a side if you're with Auden or with Hall and see who's
Or
right.
people can read them. They'll get to it. We'll put
Mhm.
some of this in the notes. Some
Mhm.
links, and people can just Google, honestly, and look it up. It's all pretty much available. Well, maybe we should go right to Bulwark, Like a Bulwark, which
Sure.
again in the book, it's called Like a Bulwark. It appears as Bulwarked Against Fate, and maybe you could you read it for us? That would be great.
Sure. I've got it. I've got the collected poems version or
Okay.
complete
Which is
poems
the
version.
final, and she was a
Mhm.
tinkerer with her own work,
Yeah.
famously, and somewhat to I think other poets don't do that because they're supposed to be perfect, these poems, but
Yeah.
she did
Yeah.
not have that attitude, and so the final one that she supervised, though, is I think the one we should take as her final word, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Although there's some disagreement.
Okay.
Like a bulwark, affirmed, pent by power that holds it fast. A paradox, pent, hard pressed, you take the blame and are inviolate. Abased at last, not the tempest tossed, compressed, firmed by the thrust of the blast, till compact, like a bulwark against fate. Lead saluted, saluted by lead, as though flying old glory, full mast.
Yeah, there's an awful lot compressed in there, so
Yeah.
say, I don't know, you want to just go through it almost, line by line, of that first
It
word, affirmed, that's pretty
affirmed,
striking.
yeah. It's her. She's hard to read because of the way that she controls the syllables. They're it's described as light rhyme, so she doesn't use rhythm in a formal way, but her own way, which makes it kind of hard because it doesn't. Most poetry, you think of following the breath and kind of respecting the reader, but she pushes the reader to do what she wants them to do, and
I mean,
you can feel that when you read it.
yeah, but even I noticed, there were internal rhymes and
Yeah,
repetitions of certain
yeah,
sounds. The fast, last, tempest, thrust. I mean, that
yeah.
she's
It's
obviously
there.
it's there. It's just different from what people like me are more used to, which is maybe more 19th century kind of
Yeah.
the words end on a certain sound and so forth. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, and that was it. This was really exciting back then. That it was pushing the form forward, and like you couldn't get to the poetry we have today, where it's mostly free verse without someone like her pushing past the formal rhyme schemes.
So, what do you make of the poem as a whole in terms of its meaning, if I can use that word, or substance? I mean, I think they're anyway. You go first, then I'll say what tiny thoughts I have.
It's so all critics like to joke that all poetry is about poetry,
Right.
and it's the style of that is called ars poetica, where it's self-referential. Marianne Moore is interesting because all of her poetry is defensive and is very concerned with protection and danger and defense, and just kind of there is like these hard shells that you encounter in her writing. And like a bulwark, the common reading is about it's about her and her kind of feeling pent and uh,
Hard pressed.
yeah, yeah.
But I guess I was struck. I mean, just she seems to want to say, and I mean, whether I'm sure it's about her and about poetry, but it also seems to be about America in a way. I mean, the
Mhm.
old glory thing is so conspicuous at the end,
Right.
and she seems to, I don't know, just read it that somehow she is taking the side of, if I can put it that way, of compression and of
Hmm.
almost the allusion at the end to lead saluted by lead. I mean, bullets was compressed into hard bullets. It's a kind of hard nosed version, if I can put it that way,
Yeah.
of America, of what it means perhaps to be an American, but also a poet, but also a citizen. You
Mhm.
have to be kind of. I guess I felt it reading it as that it was kind of anti-sentimental. I'm not sure that's right, but
Yeah.
and that
No,
I'm very
definitely.
struck by the phrase "not the tempest tossed." So
Hmm.
tempest tossed is from obviously the Emma Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty, and she seems to want, which is famous and revered, and it's wonderful. We take all the tempest tossed people, and she sort of doesn't. I mean, she goes out of her way to say not that, but rather,
Hmm.
compressed, formed by the thrust of the blast. I mean, it is. Uh, it's I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but it feels to me like she really wants to make that point that being serious about life or about patriotism or about poetry requires a certain, or at least requires is too strong, but in her case, at least, leads to a certain kind of tough-mindedness.
No, exactly. That's pretty much dead on. And this is a theme that's repeated through all of her work. So she was raised Presbyterian. She was a preacher's kid, and you would think that her religion would show up in her writing, but it doesn't really. There is a constant refrain of self-reliance and man ultimately being responsible for his circumstances and environment.
Yeah, and that, as though flying Old Glory full mast. So it's nice to fly Old Glory, but you sort of need the lead
Yeah.
saluted by lead, which is sort of the writing shortly after a little bit after World War II, and in the Cold War, has a little bit of that. Feels to me. Was she very political in general, or?
No, she kind of she kept a distance from that mostly, it seems. Um, the in the poems that do get closest to making political statements, like the one that Auden likes, she doesn't like. She doesn't feel that those are poetic, or they they're too obvious in her opinion. She likes the complex mazes that make you work for kind of a better payoff than just kind of commentary.
But I also feel that maybe, I mean, I gather she was, I don't really know much about this. She doesn't seem to have been very involved in any, unlike many of her modernist peers,
Right.
either in kind of the temptation. She doesn't seem to have been seduced by the temptations of fascism. She was quite
No.
anti-fascist, I think, very early,
Yeah.
nor the temptations of communism, which God knows was also a big deal in the 30s and after. So in that respect, she feels to me like someone who's hard-headed in that way too, right? Anti a kind of
Very stubborn.
foolish
Yeah.
utopianism and
Yeah.
infatuation with mass movements and so
Yeah.
forth.
She had a very strong moral sense of principle and ethics that, I mean, is probably grounded from having a Presbyterian upbringing, but uh, plenty of people have been seduced from, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Anything else on? Anyway, so what? And you just were struck. Of course, you were struck like a bulwark, but it does. I
Yeah.
feel like it's a little bit captures the spirit of the real of our
It
bulwark.
does,
Kind
yeah.
of.
It's funny how, I mean, time is circular, and it felt very prescient to read right now, that the similarities and
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I remember growing up in New York. Just another word about Moore. I mean, that
Mhm.
she was sort of she was famous.
She
I mean,
was
someone
famous,
like
yeah.
I knew of her in a very vague way. I was not a big poetry person, certainly not a modernist poetry person, but but in New York, the fame was kind of she was a character. When she'd moved to New York, incidentally, very young from the Midwest, and had lived in New York for what, like 50 years, I think, in Greenwich Village, and she was sort of a figure around town. She was a baseball fan, if I'm not mistaken, and went to a lot of Yankees games is my vague memory, and
Yeah.
would sort of that was a thing. She was a
Yeah. Because
famous
women didn't
modernist,
go to baseball games back
right? And
then very
famous
much.
modernist poets didn't somehow one
Yeah.
doesn't imagine T.S. Eliot or Pound or maybe even Auden at baseball games, and um, so that's that sort of that's my entire it was my
Yeah.
entire knowledge of her, I'd say. And
Yeah.
has she been? I mean, has she sort of had a? I don't know. Is she famous today in the way she
Oh, yeah.
was? Is she okay?
That's actually a pretty good segue into her most famous poem. It seems like every single poet I know has a Marianne Moore story, because of her most famous poem is poetry, and it's a commentary on the poets of the time, where it's both a condemnation of the old forms while also a defense of poetry and what it should be. And it's a great example. So the first line is, I too dislike it. And so it has three versions.
Yeah. So I mean, there's much longer one, which she then compresses
Hmm.
in late in life to what,
Yes.
3 lines? Is that right?
Hmm. Yeah, she
Amazing.
strips it bare to like this essential message, which most critics think was not correct to do. But it's interesting the transformation goes through. The original version that she wrote in her second collection, Observations, is 13 lines, and that is Donald Hall's favorite. And most of her, like her first version would be the best is funny, but the second version, the second iteration, the longer one, is the most popularly famous one. And then everyone pretty much dislikes the last one.
But she defends I mean, doesn't she explicitly say, I read that, my Wikipedia
Mhm.
level knowledge of
Yeah.
this, that the omissions are on purpose or something. I mean, she sort of
Mm.
defends her late
Yeah, she puts that as the yeah.
stripping away of
Mhm.
excess. So read the short, maybe the short version, the 3-line version at
Okay,
least.
we'll start with the last version of it.
Yeah.
Poetry. I too dislike it. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine.
Pretty amazing. No, so I too dislike it, I think was always the first line. Is that right?
Mhm.
That's a
Yes,
famous,
that
that
is.
became sort of, and the it is poetry, presumably.
Yes, it's kind of it's a subject of great debate where she's talking about the kind of poetry that was anything artificial. She finds contemptuous. She does not appreciate poetry that she finds dishonest or hiding the ball from the reader or trying too hard. She has no patience for it, and she even calls it immoral at one point. The the
So
longer versions
was
get
it just
into
on the
that
short one?
more.
So reading it, let me just say a few words with it. Reading it, however, with a
Mhm.
perfect contempt for it. So she has, yes, you say contempt. That's kind of insulting to her fellow poets, but
Yeah.
whatever. Um, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. That's a pretty genuine. Is that a word? Is that something that that
Mhm.
captures what she thought was important? I suppose.
Yes, that's like her cri de core, her guiding principle that she cares about is that all poetry should ultimately point back to beauty and truth, and um, that's yes.
But it's kind of I guess hard-headed by the way of saying it. That, I mean, there's always going to be this, you know, stuff around it, I suppose, that she has a certain contempt for. But if you
Yes.
read it, you discover, after all, a place for the genuine. It's a very modest claim in a certain way, though I suppose also a very bold claim. I don't know. I mean,
It's part of the charm of the modernists is that they're very ironic, that they love to contradict themselves and kind of go back and forth. But it in the context of when she was writing it, she's kind of explicitly attacking the old forms of poetry, which were stodgy in the modernists' opinion. So they were this is kind of like a battle cry almost to the later versions to reinvigorate poetry, and biggest criticism that she receives for the longer version is that they are too prescriptive, that it of declaring what poetry should be rather than letting the medium flourish as its own wherever it wants to go.
that's so interesting. Do you want to read what the 13-line version that Donald
Yeah,
Hall likes a lot, or
yeah,
why
I'd love
not?
to.
Okay, okay.
Poetry. Oh, and this one, the structure is a little different. I too dislike it, and then she's got a colon. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. The bat upside down, the elephant pushing, a tireless wolf under a tree, the baseball fan, the statistician, business documents and school books. These phenomena are pleasing, but when they have been fashioned into which is unknowable, we are not entertained. It may be said of us all that we do not admire what we cannot understand. Enigmas are not poetry.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's funny because she still doesn't have like the famous line is poems with real toads in it, which you don't get until the final version. But here we have her introducing the quotes. She loves quoting things, and there's some debate over whether she's doing that to kind of distance herself from it, or she defends it as saying, if someone has already said it perfectly, I'm just gonna put it in there. Like I don't need to rewrite something that's already correct. Um, it's interesting.
But it's such a yeah. So it's really, kind of defense of the maybe the everyday, you might say, though, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that we have to
Yeah.
capture what's true and impressive about the everyday, and not just
Yeah.
this grandiose. I guess it's a critic of the
Yeah.
she's a critic
The
of the
sublime.
grandiosity of so much of poetry. Is that right? And which,
Mhm.
of course, is what makes it also attractive in some ways to people
Mhm.
who are, reading
Yeah.
some of these poems, right? I mean,
It seemed that the modernists were kind of tired with how highfalutin some of the older writing was, and how tired some of the comparisons were made. So, something that she does a lot is bring in rare and uncommon animals to make her metaphors. Sometimes they work, sometimes they're a little bit too complicated and kind of too, like, one of her more famous poems is also called it's she compares a mountain to an octopus. And I mean, there's whimsy in it, but it's also a little like she's very demanding of her reader's imagination, and she sees that as a virtue, but it can be a little frustrating.
what else should people read, and what do you want to maybe take us through one or two more? What do you like?
Sure. Let's see. I've got.
What was the one Auden liked so much
Oh yeah, we should
World
read
War
that one.
during World War II, right?
This one's a little longer. Let's see. Let's see if I could. There are parts of it.
Or just say a word about it. We don't need to read it. People can go for
So
themselves.
in Distrust of Merits, it's longer and it has a more formal style. Like you can see the stanzas are all pretty uniform. She uses repetition in it more than Donald Hall does not like this poem because he feels like it's obvious, and she also doesn't like it very much because she felt like it was just a testimony. Like it's just kind of your basic. It's very accessible. Like if you go and read it, like I'm struggling to read. Like even though I've read these other her earlier work multiple times, like it's still like the syntax of them is hard to get through. But Distrust of Merits, like it's very accessible. It's and there's a reason why Auden picks it. It does touch on. Uh, I'll read a part of it. O alive, who are dead, who are proud not to see. O small dust of the earth that walks so arrogantly. Trust begets power, and faith is an affectionate thing. We vow, we make this promise to the fighting. It's a promise. We'll never hate black, white, red, yellow, Jew, Gentile, untouchable. And that's all in quotes. We are not contempt to make our vows. With set jaw, they are fighting, fighting, fighting. Some we love, whom we know. Some we love, but know not. That hearts may feel and not be numb. It cures me, or am I what I can't believe in? And it goes on and on and on. But there is much more rhythm, and she carries the reader more than in her other work.
Would you say it's a little bit of a debunking almost of the kind of glory of, this is 1944, right? Of
Yeah.
the kind of glory of war sort of stuff. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it's probably the most reactionary of her work because it's like directly commenting on a current event versus kind of pointing the reader towards a more into the mirror maze like of her qualities of her other work. So it's I'm of two minds. Like you have the Audens of the world, and like and it helped propel her to fame because it introduced her to a wider audience, and it was accessible so people could understand it, and it touched on the feelings of the time. So I think there's a lot of value in that, and clearly it strikes a nerve with a lot of readers. But the modernists are kind of disappointed in it because it doesn't have quite the same like felicity of language and qualities that they are looking for.
did she have a favorite poem of her own? I mean, do we
She
know?
did. She did. It was one of the slightly earlier ones, I think. What are years is later. Where did it go? What are years is slightly more lyric, honestly, which is funny. What did she say about it? Days of Prismatic Color. I have a lot of notes that I am a little bit lost in. What are yours? Okay. So it's one of her favorites. It's man's moral possibilities to create a foundation for hopes, a basis upon which to build his own salvation. So, kind of what I was saying earlier about how her faith doesn't really appear that often, but when it does show up, there's this reaffirmation of humanity rather than pointing towards God. There's a pointing inward towards man shoring up confidence or courage even, which is interesting. And I think that I think you see that most in What Are Years, and that was also, it's funny, her she puts the title poems, it's like the first poem in the collection, and it's usually the strongest.
And so when is that from? What are your, that's
That would have been 19, like the mid 1930s.
oh,
So
so it's
still like mid career. Yeah.
so interesting. What else? Anything? What else should we know? And one thing I'm struck by. Well, let's say one more word about the actual poetry and just what, as a poet, what strikes you, and what, what's the sort of distinctive talent, as it were, that maybe others don't have.
It's funny. There's a lot of contradiction. When I first started reading about her, I was really excited because they all describe her brilliant surfaces. So what she does with language is very beautiful and it's interesting. But then I kind of got a little frustrated with it because she claims that like the best thing that you can do as a poet is be truthful and concrete, but she deplores being explicit. So she champions complexity, but clarity is what she holds dear. And but so like these two things you would think are in tension, but her work suggests that they are not.
That's a good way of putting it. Right, there's a kind of grace and clarity, the very short sentences or partial sentence fragments, I guess you'd say, literally, and at least in, for example, in like a Bulwark, right? And that first one word sentence at the beginning, affirmed, which I guess is what courts do when they uphold a
Yeah.
decision. So it begins with a very kind of almost dry, you might say,
Legalistic, yeah.
clarity, and then, but as you said, then the complexity of it with all the back and forth, and it really is. Yeah, it's a nice way of putting it. And maybe that's just life. It is a weird combination of clarity and complexity. I'm struck by how, just again from my like Wikipedia level reading about this, I mean, they were such big figures, these American modernists, and one thinks of America. Maybe this is slightly colored by the current moment, that the people want to go back to the 20s and 30s. Allegedly they do, and sort of make America great again world, or the 40s and 50s. And but this was part of America too, right? I mean, and they were important, these figures, and they
Oh,
weren't.
they were huge, yeah.
And they were mostly obviously in intellectual circles and in New York and so forth, but not simply. I mean, magazines publish poetry and so forth, and it is sort of impressive. And it is I mean, I don't know how much of the modernism is imported really from Europe or from Britain, and how much of it's American. A fair number of the names one associates with it are really American, aren't they? I mean,
it's almost wholly American. Like there are bits and pieces that take from like French symbolists, but like they were working independently. And Marianne Moore claims that like she wasn't influenced by any of the European styles, even though they have their own kind of, like you said, thing going on. But no, she reached like astonishing levels of fame during her time. And it's funny, the American aspect of her, it's funny in the later years, after she wins the Pulitzer, Ford Motor Cars comes to her, and New Yorker publishes the Ford correspondence where she is asked to come up with names for one of their new cars, and the car is rather not great, but the correspondence about it, they don't eventually use one of her titles, but it's so lovely. It's very whimsical and charming and deeply American. The interaction with the automobile and mythology.
yeah, no, and I mean, I just feel this is this. I hope the spirit of the Bulwark, which is both very American. I would say most of us are. We are almost all American, a couple of Canadians, and very English speaking. I don't think we're that wildly cosmopolitan, most of us, but also part of America is this, right? It's not just I don't know what sort of chest beating, I don't know, patriotic poetry from the World War II or something. Even the chest beating patriotic poetry, incidentally, is not what people think it is, right? I mean, it's not nearly as chest beating, and it's much more complicated. And
no,
but
the symbols all point back to other themes of identity and strength and courage, and they're usually using talking about war to talk about other things.
just if people who wanted to be patriotic, which is fine. Just that the part of being patriotic is being proud of this tradition too, I should think. It is a very, I don't know, is it the most important distinctive American poetic tradition? I guess it could be,
You
right?
probably could say that. Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, the people they look back to, I guess, would be Dickinson, right? And Whitman, maybe, I mean, from the
Yeah.
19th century in particular.
Exactly.
Also great Americans who were not, to my knowledge, they were not Anglophile, the way some of the early American poets were kind of, very influenced by English, by poets from Britain and so forth. I don't know that
Yeah.
that's so much the case with those. So it is really an American thing, right?
It
And
is. Yeah. Absolutely.
so I hope you can make American poetry great again. And maybe we should get some more people to read things like this, though, because it so much complexifies the, if I can use that word, to one's understanding of what America was like, really back, back in the good old days that everyone wants to yearn for. But the good old days were more complicated than people think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Final words about Marianne Moore, about poetry in general. Is poetry doing okay in America? Can I ask you that as a young poet?
Yeah. It's had its ups and downs. The screen attention economy has kind of there's been some pushing back between the high literary establishment and then the commercial poets. So you have some more. It's a tale as old as time. You have the high literary and the popular kind of fighting as always. But no, I think there are still some. They're not the modernist natural successors. People like Carl Phillips and other like our poet laureates. They all are doing very good work that carries on a great American tradition of pushing language forward in interesting ways.
That's nice. That's a nice note to end on. A great American tradition, which is forward-looking, though, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. This has really been fascinating. People should read anything. People can go find these poems. We'll
Oh
put
yeah, I'll
some
I'll
links,
give them a list.
and yes, you should in the links, and they can look for themselves. It's all pretty accessible. So, Hannah, thanks so much for joining me today. It's really been fascinating,
Thank you for having me.
and thank you all for joining us on Bulwark on Sunday.